Fellas, let's cut straight to the heart of the matter. If your understanding of the 1929 crisis comes from mainstream narratives, you're walking around with a head full of myths. It's not just a little off, it's a complete fabrication, a concoction of half-truths and outright lies. Imagine holding onto a belief so fiercely only to discover it was debunked before you even learn it. That's the real deal with the Marxist theory on the 1929 crisis. That's being relentlessly spoon-fed in educational institutions. It was dismissed and discredited even before the Wall Street crash grabbed the headlines. What you have been told is a version so distorted it might as well be fiction. This narrative has been sculpted carefully over decades, entrenched deeply within our educational system, purporting a view of capitalism and market operations that is not just flawed but fundamentally false. The real story is far more complex and significantly different from the simplistic explanations of economic cycles that are often regurgitated by those who haven't dug beneath the surface. Now, let's dissect what's been touted about 1929 in academic circles. It's a story that crumbled under scrutiny long before today's historians took their first lecture notes. Yet, despite its debunking, this twist tale persists, recycled through generations, morphing into a truth in the minds of those who heard it. This isn't education, it's indoctrination, a deliberate shaping of minds to adhere to a particular ideological narrative that's miles away from the actual events that unfolded. Why focus on 1929? Why not earlier on later crises? Consider this. Entrepreneurs and market movers didn't suddenly decide to throw caution to the wind without cause or provoke an economic meltdown out of sheer greed or ignorance. The portrayal of this event as a fundamental flaw of capitalism ignores the very nature of economic cycles and market corrections. Interestingly, a similar crisis that occurred in 1920 was swiftly resolved by 1921 without prolonged suffering or dramatic intervention. Why isn't that a quick resolution the subject of similar scrutiny and debate? It's because it doesn't fit the established narrative that aims to critique and dismantle the foundations of free market principles. This is where we dive deep and uncover the shadow players of the 1929 debacle, the same entitles that orchestrated the chaos of 2008, the usual suspects, overreaching governments and central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, manipulating economic levers behind the scenes. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's economic reality, evidenced by repeated cycles of boom and bust that correlate strongly with misguided monetary policies and artificial manipulation of interest rates. These actions create distortions in the market, misleading signals that lead to malinvestment, excessive risk-taking, and ultimately financial disasters. The sad irony is that these calamities are often used to justify even more intervention by the very entitles that caused them in the first place. When the market is allowed to function without this distortion, as it briefly did in the early 1920s, recovery is rapid and far less painful. One has to wonder, if the market mechanisms were allowed to operate unhindered more often, how many crises could be mitigated or even avoided altogether? Diving into the abyss of governmental overreach, we find a bewildering array of missteps and errors that have compounded over time. Let's talk about artificially low interest rates and the flood of cheap money that distorts the essential economic principle of time preference. How individuals value present goods versus future goods. This manipulation skews incentives, encourages reckless borrowing, and leads to bubbles that inevitably burst, leaving devastation in their wake. The US housing market saga is a textbook example of this phenomenon. Driven by policies that encourage overlending and underwriting risk loans, the market was pumped up on the steroids of easy credit, only to collapse under its own weight. The aftermath mirrored the devastation of the 1929 crash, yet the lessons that should have been learned remain unheeded. As if monetary manipulation weren't damaging enough, fiscal policies like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of the 1930s added fuel to the fire, ostensibly designed to protect American jobs by imposing high tariffs on important goods. This act instead throttled international trade, provoked retaliatory tariffs from trading partners, and deepened the global economic depression. This is a classic example of a policy with unintended consequences. Aimed at saving jobs, it ended up destroying many more. Moreover, the government's heavy hand didn't stop at tariffs. Wages were manipulated, prices were fixed, and taxes were raised to cover the burgeoning costs of these interventions. Each step only further destabilizing the economy and prolonging the misery of the Depression. So the harsh lessons of the Great Depression as well as the 2008 financial meltdown are clear. Excessive intervention in the economy by government and central banks can have disastrous consequences. These historical events serve as a potent reminders of the dangers of straying too far from market principles. True recovery and sustainable economy health begin when market distortions are corrected, when policies that respect economic freedoms are reinstated and natural market forces are allowed to realign financial systems. The takeaway from this historical reflection is straightforward yet profound. Respect the intrinsic mechanisms of the market. Resist the temptation to manipulate economy outcomes artificially, and foster policies that support economic stability rather than undermine it. History has shown us repeatedly that departures from these principles are fraught with risks. Let's not repeat the mistakes of the past. Instead, let's move forward with a commitment to policies that enhance, not hinder, economic resilience and prosperity. This is not just a lesson in economics. It's a blueprint for a more stable, prosperous future.